JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Folks, after 2 years of COVID, numerous incidents of gun violence, threats to women's rights, voting rights, and our environment, we understand well the fragility of life and the inevitability of change. In EMS, I'm an EMS person, when we have a stroke victim, we maintain their breathing and rush them to the hospital. We're working within the so-called golden hour. If we can get a clot buster like TPA into the veins within 60 minutes of the symptoms onset, the patient has a decent shot at a full recovery. Well, folks, our American face is drooping, our arms are weakening, and our speech is slurring. And we may only have a couple of golden years before the damage is irreversible. But tonight, we have some good news. There is a congressman in the House who will share an incredible life and perhaps offer us a sedative for our concerns and a path for our country's rehabilitation. In addition to a BA from Harvard College and a JD from Harvard Law School, Congressman Jamie Raskin was also a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College for more than 25 years. He has authored several books, including the Washington Post bestseller, Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People, and the highly acclaimed We the Students, Supreme Court cases for and about American students. Congressman Raskin was a 3-term state senator and majority whip in Maryland, where he successfully introduced and championed several nationally significant and landmark pieces of legislation. His accomplishments are numerous, his story amazing, and his bravery incredible. Who would have believed after his brilliant role as impeachment manager that he would have the energy and the wherewithal to sit on the committee now investigating the January 6th assault on Capitol Hill that threatened the certification of the 2020 election. Having survived angry mobs storming the hallways of Congress, Representative Jamie Raskin remains driven, devoted, and prepared. Tonight, we will lend him our ears and hopefully our hearts as he discusses his book, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. It is a story of tragedy, redemption, despair, and survival that includes a captivating and powerful first-hand account of the January 6th riots, the impeachment trial of Donald Trump, and the loss of his son, Tommy. He carried this incredible burden with the strength of God and the belief that his son was right there with him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congressman Jamie Raskin to the Hampton.
You know, when it all started, I went out, and I've got a friend who's a professor of classics at Howard University, and I asked him whether there was a Greek god of trauma. And he said, no, there was no Greek god of trauma. So I tried to imagine one, a god kind of like Janus, you know, the god that looks backwards and forwards at the same time. And I imagined that the god of trauma would be just the sneakiest, most evil of gods who could cheat you out of everything that you love and what is most precious to you in life and steal from you that which makes your life worth living. And then the god of trauma turns around, and just as you're about to give up on everything, the god of trauma offers you a connection to the rest of the world and to other people far more profound than anything you ever imagined was possible, because you're able to connect with other people's sorrow and other people's struggles, because that's part of the human condition too. And so if you say to the god of trauma, as I think of it, well, I see what you mean. You can take what's most precious to me, but you can connect me in a profound way to other people. And it sounds interesting, but I'd rather not take that bargain. That's the catch. And the God of Trauma says, well, it's not up to you. That is in the nature of the human condition. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about the book, and I'm happy to talk about the country. And I thank all of you for coming tonight and for inviting me to the great Long Island. So,
thank you. We're definitely going to talk about the book, but I was inspired by something that you just said. You're talking about Janus, right, the two-faced Roman god who looks backwards and forwards in terms of being the god of trauma, or a model for the god of trauma.
yeah.
I was thinking also, just in the same, when you said that, what occurred to me was the four-letter name of God, the Hebrew name of God, right, which is spelled Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, is spelled that way because it makes up the letters of the Hebrew words Haya, Hoveh, V'Yihiyeh, which means was, is, and will be. And according to the rabbis, when God speaks to Moses at the burning bush, he says, tell the Israelites, this is my name, because I want them to know that I'm with them through this trauma, through the trauma of servitude in Egypt, and I'm going to be with them through future traumas, through all the terrible things that are inevitably going to happen. So there's even a Jewish parallel to that, where the God of trauma is really a God of presence. It's a God that's with you, saying that the trauma is going to continue. There's always going to be things past, present, and future, but there's a certain level of empathy, which is how you deal with trauma. And I think in your book, you talk about that a lot. You talk about the support that you received from family and friends, and from colleagues, and from so many people across your district and across America who reached out to you. The empathy is so much a part of dealing with trauma, both on a personal level and also maybe a political level also.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful. Thank you for telling me that. I don't know if I'm going to remember all of the vowels and consonants, but thank you for telling me that, because it has been empathy, other people's empathy, and the empathy that I can feel back that has kept me going. So I appreciate that, and it has been very much an opening and learning experience.
So I want to ask you, even before we start talking about the content of the book, just in general, like, how did you even manage to write it? I read the first 200 pages in one sitting. Parts 1 and part 2. And at the end of those 200 pages, my hands were shaking. And I put it down, and I was thinking, I think I told a few people in this room, I really don't want to ask Congressman Raskin any questions. I really just want to give him a hug. It was like a wrenching read. It was so personal, and it was so passionate, and it was so terrible on the personal side and the political side. And I'm wondering, first, how does a book like this get written, 400 pages, so quickly after those terrible events? And I'm wondering what writing a book like that so quickly does to you, mentally or emotionally. Was it therapeutic? Was it cathartic? Was it terrible? Describe the writing of this book.
Well, thank you for that question, Rabbi. Actually, it was 900 pages when I turned it in. It turned into, I think, 450 pages. But when I turned it in, my editor said something interesting. He said, the book is ready to go, but you wrote 2 books. And one of them is the book that, we signed the contract for, about these 50 days in your life, because we lost Tommy on the last day of 2020 on New Year's Eve. 1 week later was the insurrection. And 1 week after that, we impeached Trump in the House for inciting the insurrection. And then a month after that, the trial ended. But when we had the impeachment, Speaker Pelosi asked me to be the lead manager of the impeachment. And so it's also about those 4 weeks leading up to the trial. And unlike everything that's going on now with the Select Committee, we had no witnesses. It was based completely on public statements and public evidence, and we didn't have time for any of that. And even organizing it within 1 month, you saw that Senator McConnell said, although he thought that Donald Trump was singularly, factually, ethically guilty, he still voted to acquit because he didn't think the Senate had jurisdiction to try a former president, although the Constitution says the Senate can try anyone who's been impeached, and he was impeached lawfully while he was still president for his crime against the Union. But in any event, so when it was all over, I was totally sleepless. I mean, I couldn't sleep. I was completely insomniac. And I realized that the only way I was going to make it through was to write this book about these 50 days and what had just taken place in my life. And I needed to record it. I figured I would spend the rest of my life obsessed and stuck with what happened if I didn't try to at least tell the story of what had just taken place. So that's why I wrote it. It took like 4 or 5 months to write it. But the way that you described reading it is kind of how I wrote it. I mean, it was straight through. And I did take it to be a therapeutic, cathartic experience to do it. Although then when it was all done, the publisher said, okay, well, now we're going to do the audio book. And I said, well, who are we going to get to do that? And they said, you're doing it. And I said, no, I don't think I can do that. And they said, you've signed a contract. And so you see how close I was in analyzing the contract. But I ended up doing it. And it was a very wrenching, difficult process. But a lot of people listen to those, and they've written me about that. So I feel good about the fact that I did do it, you know.
I was struck by a passage in the beginning of the book where you're describing the events in the Capitol on January 6th, and you write about how through all the different emotions that were going through your mind, going through your body as you were being shuttled from place to place, and as you were scared for your life and the lives of your children that were there in the Capitol with you, you said you didn't feel any fear.
No.
You felt anger, you felt a lot of other things, but you didn't feel fear because after Tommy had died, you said the worst had already happened to you, and you couldn't take anything else away. And you felt so many things but not fear. And you felt that very strong sense of mission and resolve and purpose. And I think we all saw that over the few weeks that came afterwards. And certainly you write about that. It was almost as though you were kind of on this adrenaline rush. You were laser focused. You were on TV all the time. We can imagine the amount of work that goes into an impeachment so soon after so much trauma like that. And I'm wondering, at what point did that adrenaline rush start to move away? Did that sense of single-minded purpose begin to abate? Or maybe it hasn't. Maybe the book was part of that.
Yeah, no, it's not gone away. I mean, it's not over until it's over, and it's not over yet, you know.
When is it over?
Well, let's hope it's over soon. You know, in a democracy, people have a right to the truth. And, you know, Madison said the awful truth of their rulers and what they do. But that is part of being a grown-up in a democracy, that you've got to deal with the reality of what government is like and what has happened. And that's why we're telling this story to people. It's one thing to hear there was an attempted coup in your country. It's another thing to hear, you know, there was a violent insurrection in your country. But we're now actually telling the story of who did what, because those were human beings who were doing it, and it was a lot of human beings who stood up to try and stop it. And there were lots of heroes who defended our democracy across the political spectrum, who understood what it means to have a constitution and to believe in the rule of law. You know, in a democracy, you have to accept that sometimes you might lose. It's not always about winning. You know, the political scientists tell us that there are two characteristics of fascist parties, of authoritarian parties around the world. One is they don't accept the results of elections if they lose, and the other is they embrace political violence, or they don't reject political violence. So everybody should think about that. You know, Madeleine Albright, in her book that she wrote before she died about fascism, said it's important to remember that fascism doesn't always have a fixed and finite ideological content. There's certain feelings and impulses that gravitate towards it, anti-Semitism being one, ultranationalism being another, racism. But she said that's shifting. But what fascism really is a strategy to take power at any and all costs and never to let go of it.
Based on your experiences over the last several months, whether it was the impeachment or now the Select Committee, It's been very clear that you're a passionate believer in small d democracy, right? Not necessarily the Democratic Party, or not necessarily one set of political positions, although you have those, but the transformative power of democracy itself.
Yes.
Right, the idea of democracy. I'm wondering if your experiences over these past several months have made that belief, have reinforced that belief?
Yes.
Or if they've challenged that belief. I knew you were going to say that, but explain why.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for, I mean, it is...
because a lot of us don't.
Yes, no, I understand. Well, I believe ultimately in the goodness of people. I believe in the wisdom of crowds. And I believe that democracy is the only system that can work for everybody and for the vast majority of people. And from the standpoint of democracy, every other political system, autocracy, theocracy, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, every other political system has the quality of the emperor's new clothes. It's always somebody dressing up their own interest in some fancy garb, but it's nonsense. And democracy is the only system ultimately that is radically committed to the welfare and the thriving of each individual and the rights of every person. That is our birthright as Americans, to believe in democracy. And it doesn't mean I believe democracy always gives us the right answer, and it doesn't mean that democracy has always been perfect. Democracy is not a stationary object. Democracy is a growing, dynamic thing. Democracy, in the 1980s or 90s is very different from American democracy in the 1940s or 50s or the 1840s or 50s. It has been these struggles for inclusion that have transformed our country, right? I mean, if you look at the 17 constitutional amendments that we've had since the original Bill of Rights, the vast majority of them are suffrage expanding, democracy deepening amendments, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives us equal protection and due process. The 15th Amendment says no race discrimination in voting. The 17th Amendment shifts the mode of election of U.S. senators from the legislatures to the people, to all the people. The 19th Amendment doubles the franchise in America by counting women in. Women's suffrage. The 23rd Amendment gives people in Washington, D.C. the right to participate in presidential elections, although still not in congressional. The 24th Amendment bans poll taxes. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. You can read our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments that have followed as the chronicle of the struggle for the people for democratic inclusion. And that's an extraordinary thing to be part of this project. When you look all around the world, and most people are still living the way people lived before the American Revolution. I mean, the revolutionaries, Jefferson and Paine and Franklin and Madison, those guys said, we want to create a system of government for the first time that's founded on popular self-government. Even with all of their contradictions and their hypocrisies and so on, that was the ideal. For the vast majority of the history of this species that we're in, people have lived under dictators and kings and czars and emperors and people like Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And the whole point of America was to get away from that. And that involved the separation of powers, and it involved federalism and dividing power up vertically, and it involved passing a Bill of Rights that would be so radical that it would include even the rights of women to make their own decisions about reproduction and procreation, a right which is now under profound attack by a Supreme Court that has been gerrymandered. And our real problem today is, I think, what the sentiments of the vast majority of the people in the country are about democracy and freedom versus political institutions and practices that are like a straitjacket and that are antiquated because we have not allowed the motor of democracy to keep progressing. So what do we have? Voter suppression statutes, gerrymandering of our state and federal legislative districts, the use of the filibuster to shut down voting rights legislation, to shut down gun safety legislation, to shut down the attempt to codify Roe versus Wade. These are minority groups that are exercising tyranny against the majority. That is the struggle that we're in America today. How do we get out of that? And it's going to take some Houdini-like maneuvers on our part to figure out how we do that while still keeping faith with the Constitution and the rule of law.
And yet your faith has been strengthened and reinforced over the last several months.
I'm with John Dewey, who said the only solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy. And what we're suffering from today is not democracy, it's impediments and obstacles to democracy. So...
I have 2 more questions for you, and then we'll begin the audience question and answer. One question is, I was thinking about some of the threads that tie together the 2 parts of the book, right? The 2 parts are you struggling.
Thank you for reading my
coping.
book so carefully.
Hopefully.
That means a lot to me. So.
I read it twice. It was you dealing with the loss of your son. And the second part of the book, of course, is the politics around January 6th and its aftermath. And they're both traumas. There's a personal trauma, there's a national trauma. And besides just the fact that we called them traumas, I was wondering what the connection was. And I think the connection, and I think you've been talking around this for the last several minutes, is that dealing with personal trauma really comes down to empathy. It comes down to people who are standing with you. It comes down to you recognizing that you can't do it by yourself and that you're being dependent on so many people. There's so many pages in the book where you express thanks and gratitude to friends and to neighbors and to political colleagues and to Nancy Pelosi and to anybody that stood with you and helped you just keep going when you were facing your personal struggles. And I think to a certain degree what you've been saying over the last several responses is that democracy itself is an exercise in realizing interdependence, right? Nobody can say, I can do it by myself, or we're the only people that matter. And that's why January 6th was so traumatic in that way. It was an attempt by one group of people to say, we don't care what the rest of you think, in a way that's completely unempathetic. And I think that's really the thread that ties together the 2 parts of your book. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think I agree with that. Yeah.
Oh, good.
I think I agree with it. I will say, obviously the 2 sides of the book are unified primarily by virtue of the fact that they both happened to me. The book really is it's a love letter to my son, Tommy, who was an extraordinary young man, who was an amazing poet. He was a great piano player. He was a born philosopher and moralist. He was a passionate vegan who convinced more people to stop eating meat than anybody I've ever met. He was a champion of human rights and peace. He was passionately opposed to war. He wanted a lot more from America and from democracy, a lot more, and everything he believed in and every fiber of his being was the opposite of what happened on January 6th, which was this explosion of madness and unreason and violence and racism and anti-Semitism. And so I've been driven, in my way to act in a way that I think Tommy would be proud of.
So your methods of living with trauma, not being victorious over trauma, because you really can't do that, but finding a way to live with trauma, are respectively writing a 400-page book and impeaching the president. Those are methods that are not necessarily available to every member of this room.
Hey, everybody might get a turn before it's over.
So my question is, for people that are reading this book, and as you've mentioned, really everybody suffers some trauma in their lives. There's
Yes.
nobody who is untouched by some trauma or another.
Yes.
What lessons about living with trauma do you want them to take away from your book, from your experiences?
I don't know. I mean, when something happens to you, everybody sends you these books, and there's like this huge literature out there. And so I tried to read some of those books, but I don't know. There's a poem I know by a great Spanish poet, And like the key line is, walker, there is no path. You must create the path by walking. And that's the way I feel about it. Everybody's going to find his or her own way through, but there's so much goodwill out there and a lot of people who will extend you their love. And I'm one of them, by the way.
I just want to say one thing to you. And this is the rabbi, not the political rabbi. This is the congregational rabbi. And the rabbi who has to bring comfort and consolation to people at a time of trial, trauma, and tribulation. And I want you to always take this with you. That when Avraham posed the question as to what you would say to someone going through trauma, you quoted a Spanish poet about walking, finding that path. And that brings this discussion full circle back to this congregation in this sacred space. You're familiar with the 23rd Psalm? Yes. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. My dear friend, Congressman Raskin, it's interesting that the psalmist, the author of the psalm who we believe in our tradition was King David. He did not say you run through the valley. He didn't say you fly over the valley. You walk. You take one painstaking step at a time, and ultimately you emerge from that valley. And that's my prayer. And that's my prayer on behalf of this entire congregation, because we have the presence here this evening of an authentic, genuine American hero. That's who you are. You are an American hero. And before you say anything, our prayer that you should continue to walk, whether it's the words of the Spanish poet or the ancient words of King David. Walk. Keep walking on that path. We are behind you. And it's a path, it's a journey that you will emerge as the great, accomplished, brilliant, gifted human being that you are. That's our prayer for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think if I lived here, I'd become in a synagogue a lot more, I gotta say. You guys have quite a synagogue, and your words mean a lot to me, and I shall fear no evil. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's basically a wrap. It's been an honor and a thrill. Thank you so much, Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.